Welcome to literary and jury charge practice. Let's start with some jury charge. Ready? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the issues in this case are issues of fraud and deceit. Fraudulent representation, or fraud as the term is used here, may be defined as false statements of material facts in a transaction made by one party to another, made with knowledge of their falsity, or made as positive statements of fact without reference to their truth or falsity, and made with the intent that the other party shall act thereon. When such other party believes such statements and relies thereon, and is induced thereby to enter into a contract or transaction, and the statements are false, and damage results to him, then such statements are fraud, which entitles the party injured to recover damages. Fraud is never presumed and must always be proved, and the burden of proof rests upon the parties asserting the fraud, the defendants in this case, to prove by a fair preponderance of the evidence, that is, the greater weight of the evidence, that he was defrauded as claimed by him. If you find the evidence on this question evenly balanced, or that it preponderates in favor of the plaintiff, then you will find a verdict in plaintiff's favor. In order to recover on the ground of fraud or fraudulent representations, the party claiming to have been defrauded must have believed and relied upon the false statements made by the other party in the transaction, and if the party claiming fraud had knowledge of the real facts in connection with the transaction in question, and relied upon his own knowledge and information, and did not rely upon the statements made to him, then there is no fraud, because the party asserting the fraud is not deceived. In this case, there is no fraud insofar as the contents of the agreement, Exhibit 4, is concerned, because it is admitted by the plaintiff that John Henry read the agreement, Exhibit 4, and knew the contents thereof, and he was not deceived as to what Exhibit 4 contained. The only question of fraud in this case is whether the defendants agreed to execute a promissory note for $3,000 to the plaintiff, and delivered Exhibit 4 purporting to be such note, and fraudulently stated to Henry that Exhibit 4 was a promissory note for $3,000, and was the note referred to in Exhibit 4, and whether pursuant thereto Henry believed said instrument to be a promissory note for $3,000. Alright, now let's practice some literary material. And this is about a group of families building generational bonds through camping. Ready? One of my favorite trips was to Zion. Driving toward the park, I saw the Virgin River flowing clear and clean. That's where we'll go tubing tomorrow, I pointed out. That night, a downpour turned the channel into a chocolate-colored river. We almost canceled the tubing, but thankfully we didn't. When we crawled out of the water at the end of the stretch, Mud plastered our hair and skin. It didn't matter. The kids had a blast, and more importantly, they learned that a little dirt never hurt anyone. As the kids grew older, they wanted to bunk with their friends instead of their parents. Our older son, Connor, moved out to the big boy tent by junior high, and I figured our younger son, Cooper, would also defect eventually. So around year 8, Clint and I downsized to a smaller tent in preparation of our next stage, empty tenters. Some traditions, however, never changed. At the end of each trip, we held a ritual called Thorns and Roses. Each camper, from youngest to oldest, would identify something that was a thorn on the trip and something that was a rose. Looking back over the camping years, my thorn is that the trips were never long enough. We had to return to civilization all too soon. My rose is that my kids learned the value of community, of working together and helping one another. They also developed an appreciation for the outdoors and even seemed to have caught the camping bug themselves. When Connor graduated from high school, he planned a camping trip to Big Bear with 4 friends. On the drive up the mountain, the van's transmission began to slip, so it was slow going. They had to push the van the last leg, and dusk had settled by the time they arrived at the campground. Exhausted, the boys set up their tents in the dark and ate instant ramen for dinner. It was a thorny start to a camping trip, but no doubt the story they'll retell in years to come, maybe even one day around a campfire with their own families. All right, back to our jury charge. Ready? If, under the rules given you find and believe from the evidence that the defendant Morris, representing the defendants at the time of making the agreement of settlement, represented and stated to Henry, acting for the plaintiff in this case, that the defendants would execute to the plaintiffs a promissory note for $3,000, and that later Morris delivered Exhibit 4 to the said Henry, and then stated to him that said Exhibit 4 was a promissory note for $3,000 and was the note referred to in Exhibit 1, and you find that the statements and the making of Exhibit 4 were done for the purpose of cheating and defrauding the plaintiff as claimed, and you further find that Henry believed said representations and believed that said Exhibit 4 was a promissory note on which the defendants were personally liable and was the note referred to in Exhibit 4 and relied and acted thereon, then you will find a verdict in plaintiff's favor for $3,000 with interest added as provided for in said Exhibit 4. On the other hand, if you fail to so find from the preponderance of the evidence, or you find the evidence equally balanced on either of these issues, or if you find that Morris did not make the fraudulent representations as claimed by the plaintiff, or you find that said Exhibit 4 was in accordance with the agreement of the parties, or that the said Henry, at the time of receiving said Exhibit 4, knew the contents and terms thereof, then in either such case you will find a verdict in defendant's favor of no cause of action. If you find a verdict in plaintiff's favor in this case, it will be for the full amount of $3,000 with interest added as provided for in Exhibit 4. If you find a verdict in defendant's favor, it will be the usual verdict of no cause of action. Some literary practice. This is called Adventures with Ben Harold. Ready? In 1961, right after college graduation, I had gotten married and moved my bride to Houston, Texas, where I took a job with the Harris County District Clerk's Office, and where I became acquainted with the field of court reporting. At that time, there were no schools in Houston that taught court reporting, but there was an official court reporter, Ben Harold, a merit writer who liked to teach and consented to add me to his next class. Ben was a World War II Navy veteran who had come to Houston after the war and founded a freelance court reporting agency. When he discovered I was studying to become a reporter, he offered to give me all of his scrap stenotype paper so I could tape it together and use it rather than buy a new pad. It saved me some money over the years and a half I studied, and I have always appreciated that encouragement and gesture. Ben was a nice guy and was typical of that generation in that he was a serious man, not one to suffer foolishness or fools. You could always trust what he said, which again, typical of that generation, was not much. You had to really listen and draw conclusions. Ben was originally trained as a court reporter in the Pittman theory of writing, and later taught himself the stenotype machine, combining Pittman and stenotype theory into what he called the Harold theory. A few years later, I became certified and began reporting. Ben sold his freelance agency and came over to the courthouse and took over one of the district courts as the official court reporter. At that time, all of the officials had been trying to get a raise for years, but had been unsuccessful. When Ben came over, he told all of them if they would each give him $500, he would get them a raise. 100% of the officials gave Ben the money he asked for, and sure enough, he not only got them a raise, he got their pay tied directly to the district judge's pay, and every time the district judges got a raise, the court reporters did too. All it took was hiring the right lobbyist, and Ben knew the right lobbyist. After I had been reporting for several years, I became interested in passing the Certificate of Proficiency and Merit examinations and began studying for the next test. We'll get back to that one. Let's try some more jury charge practice. Ready? The subject of this jury charge is an accident. Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, if, on the other hand, you believe that it was an independent person, a person who was not under the control of the defendant corporation, not an agent, servant, or employee, then it would be your duty to find that the defendant was not liable, because the defendant corporation has the right to assume that a stranger going down into the cellar to open the doors would act with due regard to the rights of third persons and would not open a door negligently from the inside, but would merely loosen the bolts and then come through the store out onto the pavement. So the issue for you to determine is, do you believe that it was an agent, servant, or employee of the defendant corporation who opened that door, or do you believe that it was an independent contractor, a stranger, as Mr. Bradford intimated that he believed it was? You should also consider whether the plaintiff herself acted as a reasonably careful person would act under the circumstances. She had a perfect right to walk on any part of that pavement. The iron doors were flush with the pavement when they were closed, and she had a perfect right to walk across those iron doors when they were level with the pavement, as she had the right to assume that nobody would suddenly and without warning open any part of that door to create an obstruction immediately in her path. If you are satisfied that the plaintiffs have established their case by a fair preponderance of the evidence and have met the burden of proof which is upon them, that an agent, servant, or employee of the defendant corporation opened that door negligently, and if you feel that the plaintiff herself did not contribute by her own negligence to cause the accident, it would be your duty to find a verdict for the plaintiff against the defendant corporation. If, on the other hand, you believe that it was not an agent, servant, or employee of the defendant corporation that caused the accident, that some third person over whom the defendant corporation had no control or no right to control caused the accident, then your verdict should be for the defendant corporation. If you find for the plaintiff, you should consider the measure of damages. Use your common sense and sound judgment. Let's get back to some literary material. Back to our adventures with Ben Harold. Ready? At that time, there were about 5 merit reporters in Houston, and I wanted to be number 6, so I dove into practicing. To make a long story short, I passed the merit and became the 7th, not the 6th, merit writer in Houston, Texas. On the Monday following my test, I was receiving a lot of congratulations from other reporters, and during the lunch hour, I was visiting with another reporter named John Leddens in his office, when Ben walked in and congratulated me, we began talking about the test. John Leddens was a merit writer also, and during our visit, he casually asked Ben why he had never taken the test. Ben just kind of shrugged and said he could pass the test anytime he wanted. He just never took the time to do so. Well, this comment was like throwing down a challenge to John. John couldn't let that remark go, and so challenged Ben to write an old merit test he had lying around the office. John was another one of the reporters in Houston who gave of his time to help other reporters upgrade their reporting efficiencies and frequently dictated the test for NSRA, the predecessor association to NCRA. And for now, that will conclude our literary and jury charge practice.